What if our questions and our doubts aren't our faith's biggest
Mm,
weakness, but its biggest strength? What if they are our faith's superpower, not its kryptonite? These questions Peter asked of himself actually went on to be the fuel that grew
yeah.
his faith. He knew that Jesus was unrelenting in his love for him.
Welcome to Living the Grace Life. I'm your host, Jennifer Sakata, and you've made your way to the corner of real grace for your real life. Today's real life takes us to two seemingly contradictory experiences: faith and doubt, and how this unexpected partnership deepens our experience of God's grace. Listen to these opening words from Niki Hardy's God, Can We Chat? There was fear. Is this the beginning of the end of my faith? Shame. I can't tell anyone. Guilt. I shouldn't be thinking these things or feeling like this. Sadness. I don't want to break up, Lord. Disillusionment. Why are your people so unkind and unloving? Disappointment. Why haven't you fixed this? Mixed with resentment. After all I've done for you, Lord, and everything I've been through? Loneliness. No one knows or understands, and I can't tell anyone. Was I losing my faith? Was everything I held close crumbling? Could I be subconsciously deconstructing my faith? Was this the beginning of the end? Maybe. I didn't know. Whatever it was, it didn't feel good. I read the opening words to Niki's book, and I knew immediately I wanted to welcome her here to our Living the Grace Life community. On paper, Niki Hardy is the Audie Award nominated author of Breathe Again and 1 Minute Prayers for Women with Cancer. Her new book, God, Can We Chat? A daringly honest guide to growing closer to God, one doubt at a time, hit the shelves this past March. And friends, you don't want to miss this book. Niki's been featured in places like the Hallmark Channel, Life Today, Relevant Magazine, 100 Huntley Street, and Premier Radio. That's just the start of her unique resume. In real life, Niki has navigated incredible loss, cancer, church hurt, and the painful uncertainty about God, who he is, and what he's really like. Along the way, Niki has come to believe that God loves a cheerful doubter. She lives in North Carolina with her husband and ridiculous doodle Charlie, who is the main reason her three grown kids come home. Help me welcome my new friend, Niki Hardy. Niki, welcome to Living the Grace Life.
Thank you, Jennifer. It's great to be here.
It's been a long time coming. I've heard about you from lots of common friends, and you have such a deep well of wisdom and life experience that I know our conversation will reach a lot of people today.
Thank you.
So tell me this. You are a proud Brit now
Mm.
living across the pond. And I have to ask, if God had an accent when he spoke to you, would it be posh British, like Downton Abbey style? Or would it be American English or something in between or nothing at all like either of those?
That is such a great question. That's brilliant. I think when God speaks to me, he either speaks out of my own inner knowing. And so it sounds like me, which is always really annoying because that's why we say, is that me, God? Because he speaks through his still small voice within us. He often speaks through nature.
Mm,
So that is obviously a universal language with
mhm.
no accent. Definitely not an American accent. I'm so sorry.
Oh, it's
Um,
okay. I get it.
and I don't think he's that posh. I think everyone hears him in their
Mm,
own accent, their own
mm.
tongue, just like after Pentecost, they all
Oh,
heard in
yes,
their
I
own.
love that.
So
Yes.
that's how I imagine it. So yes, if
Oh,
God
that's
spoke to us
perfect.
both at the same time, He'd have your accent and mine accent.
There was a friend of mine in seminary. She is Korean American, and she used to tell a joke that she knows what language God will be speaking when we make it to heaven one day. And I said, "What do you mean? What language he'll be speaking? He'll be speaking
Yeah.
lots of different language." He says, "Oh no, it'll be American English because you Americans only know one language at a time." I looked at her funny and I was like, there is some truth to that. So we'll see. We'll see. But I love that image of God as an extension of how we experience God. And I love the idea of the birds singing for the Lord and speaking in a bird
Mm.
like language to us, too. That's pretty fun. Well, accent or not, tell us a bit about Niki Hardy and how you first came to experience God's grace in your own life.
I think the first time I experienced God's grace was when I was small. I didn't grow up in a Christian household. My parents would have said they were Christian. They met in a youth group. Well, my dad
Oh,
was
okay.
Baptist, my mum was Methodist, and this was in the 60s. We went to church a little bit when we were young as kids, but I would experience God as I knew him talking to my dog. I felt that
Ah,
unconditional love, acceptance, and that he wanted to hear everything I had to tell
mm.
him. And when I came to faith in my mid to late 20s, in the first year that my husband and I were married, I
Oh,
experienced God for the first time and had a relationship with him.
mm.
It was as if I came back to that moment, as if it was like, oh, I forgot I knew that. I
Mm.
forgot I'd experienced that. I always would say, Jennifer, that I was a Christian with a lowercase c, and then I
Okay.
became a Christian with an uppercase C. I was a lowercase c
Mm.
because I was English and I wasn't Muslim or Hindu or anything else. And I was nice
Mm.
and I felt
Okay.
spiritual up mountains.
Yeah,
And yeah, I was a nice person, hadn't murdered anyone.
that's good.
Yeah, it was always a bonus. And so when I finally met Jesus, as I say, in a Victorian church with bare brick walls, just moments from Buckingham Palace, it was that moment of coming home to
Mhm.
that feeling of acceptance and love.
Hmm. Maybe like muscle memory when you practice an instrument, maybe piano, or I was a flute player for
Mm.
17 years. I haven't touched it in what seems like forever. But then there's something familiar about having it in my hands again, about hearing the notes and putting my mouth around the mouthpiece. It's familiar enough that I can pick it up and take the next step. I love that sort
And
of
I think
journey
there's an
thing.
element of we're all created in his image. So
Mm.
there is a part of coming home to that we
Hmm.
experience and the
Hmm.
familiarity of that.
Yeah, I love that. Coming home, that's a great phrase for us to jump into because in your book, God Can We Chat, it's about how your home with God was crumbling to bits. You are not a person unfamiliar with doubt. You have experienced doubt in some of the most intimate, deepest parts of your being. Your mom died from cancer, your sister died from cancer, and then you eventually were diagnosed with cancer as well. Tell us a bit about how that impacted your own relationship and experience with God. Surely
Mhm.
it was deeply impactful.
It was Jennifer, and I did question God. And
Mm,
I questioned his goodness, and I said that God, you're meant to be good. This doesn't feel good. But really, what I ended up questioning was what God had for me in
mm,
this life. I was circling around the verse where Jesus says, I have come that you might have life and life in all its
mm,
fullness, this abundant life that we're promised. And I thought, I'm not really experiencing that right
mm,
now. I must be in the storms and the troubles he said that we'd have.
mm.
And it didn't really feel like he'd overcome the world because I was in the middle of these storms and
Yeah.
troubles. So I thought maybe that abundant life is off waiting in the future for me as and when I get through this. And I thought, what if I don't get through this? Does this mean that abundant life isn't for me? Do I not get to
Yeah.
participate in that? And then I realized, and this became my first book, Breathe Again: How to Live When Life Falls Apart, because I realized that we equate that abundant life with a happy, healthy, wealthy life
Yeah.
that's Instagram fabulous. And when it doesn't happen, we think God doesn't have it for me.
Mm.
We also assume that troubles can't exist in an abundant life, but they're
Mm.
not separate things. They can live in the palm of our hand at exactly the same time, but it's how do we find that? How do we live that abundant life and experience the intimacy and connection with God right in the middle of all we're going through? So that became the questioning that came out
Mm.
of my cancer journey and became Breathe Again. Fast forward 10 years, my husband had a serious burnout and breakdown. We'd lived through other traumatic things as a family, and as a global nation had lived through the pandemic.
Yeah.
We all
Yeah.
lived through that on a global scale. We all lived through that in a community wide suffering level and experienced it on a personal level. And through that, I began to feel disillusioned, disappointed, confused, skeptical about everything I lumped
Mm.
together as God, faith, church. It was as
Mm-hmm.
if the people of God weren't peopling. They weren't loving. They
Uh,
weren't kind. They weren't being Christ-like, both on a personal level and in our church. We were pastoring a church, and on a global scale. And then I would read the Bible and go back to where I felt like I would find God in all his goodness. And I was like, hold on a minute, these stories now don't
mm.
sit so well. This looks like genocide. This would
Yeah.
be genocide if it was in the newspapers today. But I've always said it's okay because God condoned it or even ordered it. So, what am I meant to do with that now? I couldn't just say, okay, it's God's will.
Yeah.
I found myself in this place, and I remember it distinctly, Jennifer. I was feeling all these things and feeling very untethered. And as you said at the beginning, when you read that piece from God, Can We Chat? I was sad, nervous, and disappointed. I remember coming back from a walk with Charlie, our
Mm.
golden doodle, and it was early. Al was sitting on the sofa having his quiet time, praying and reading the Bible.
Mm.
I rolled my eyes with the maturity of a tween because I was like, ugh, he's so spiritual, even when life's falling apart.
Isn't it
And
funny how we do that?
oh, it was awful.
Oh,
And that
goodness.
and he was playing Amazing Grace, and it was coming over the speaker. As I went upstairs to shower, those famous words that have held so true for me for so long followed me up the stairs. You know them.
Mm.
I once
I
was
once
lost.
lost.
I once was lost, but now I'm found, was blind, but now I see. The opposite is now true for
Mm.
me. I once was found, but now I'm lost. And that's when I realized I had got to this intersection of faith and doubt, of questions
Mm.
and belief that I didn't know what to do with. And that's how I got to that place and became intimate with it all.
I think that's a very, honestly, that's a very scary place. And for a lot of us, we would much prefer skip past that and ignore that is where we're sitting and to put a happy face on it and just move on because that sounds too scary, too
Mm.
deep, too, as you wrote in your book, potentially crumbling to my faith. That's just
Yeah.
not worth the risk. But yet, what I have read in God Can We Chat is we risk intimacy with God. We risk our very faith itself when we're not willing to sit in the reality of those questions. So help us a little bit, Niki. How did you get to the place where you could begin asking some of those hard questions, saying some of those
Mm.
difficult fears out loud to the point that you could have a conversation with God about it?
First of all, it's not like I'm super spiritual and I was immediately like, oh, I must take this to the Lord. I think I tried a number of things. I tried to fake it.
Yeah.
I'm all for faking it in our faith in the short term. I know that sounds terrible and people are probably sharp intake of breath at that moment, but I know that if I don't feel like worshipping, if I actually stand up and start singing and put my
Mhm.
hands in the air, my emotions follow and
Yeah.
I can actually enter into worship. The same is true with prayer, with reading the Bible, all these kinds of things. So in the short term, it works, but in the long term, faking it with God is not
Yeah.
a healthy
Yeah.
strategy. And then I tried to force it. I just held on for dear strength because
The teeth and the big smile.
I am going to believe. And that didn't work either. And then the other
Mm,
thing I found myself doing that I think scared me the most was rather than faking it or forcing it, was fading out. This idea that I
okay.
could just slide away into the shadows and out the side door of church and nobody would notice.
Yeah.
That felt more scary, not because I wouldn't be noticed, but I didn't want that. My relationship with God was precious. It was everything else I didn't get. How did I get to the place where I could say, God, can we chat? I tried those things first and realized they didn't work. I had to address the lies I was believing
Mm.
about coming to God with all my questions. I dispel those in the book, but essentially, I'm the only one
Mhm.
because we don't talk about doubt, questioning, disillusionment, and
So
disappointment in
true.
God in
Mhm.
church.
It's dangerous, right?
So
Mhm.
we assume we're the
Yeah.
only ones. We think that we have to have certainty to be sure.
Mm.
We believe that I can't tell God that. Like, that's terrible. And then we say, I can't tell God because he's God and I'm just little old me. And so we believe these lies and they keep
Mm.
us from going to God and they keep us stuck in this place. The other one is I have to choose faith or
Yeah.
doubt. There's no middle ground. I'm either in or I'm out, and I'm either a
Yeah.
believer or I'm not. So we have to take these lies for what they essentially are and think about the truth behind them and what really is true. And once
Mhm.
we've dispelled those, we're free to go to God, who
Mm.
loves us with all our questions, who's not fazed by our questions as we are. He doesn't
Yeah.
mind, he knows them anyway. And he says, come to me, all you who are weary and heavy laden, and I will
Mm.
give you rest. And I don't know about you, but when I'm carrying questions, they're heavy and exhausting. And I love the Message
Mm.
paraphrase where Eugene Peterson puts it like this. He says, are you burnt out by religion? Are you exhausted? Come
Mhm.
to me, walk with me, talk with me, work with me, and learn the unforced rhythms of grace and
Mm.
learn to live lightly and freely. And I'm like, I love that image of walking
Yeah.
and talking along the dusty roads of Galilee and into Jerusalem with Jesus and just living life chatting with him about it all. That's what the disciples did. They asked him all sorts of questions. And
They
so
did, and express their doubts as well. How often did they need redirection or correcting? What's so beautiful and gracious about Jesus is that he didn't do it with a pointed finger. He did it understanding that they do have this mental block. He would gather them together with their questions and then invited them into sometimes a different type of understanding or to simply embrace the mystery of what they don't
mm,
understand.
exactly. And I love what you were saying about he invites us into conversation. And people
Mm,
say, yes,
mhm.
but God said, Jesus
Yeah.
said, don't doubt, have faith. And he said, oh, ye of little faith. And I said, did he say that? And they're like,
Mm.
yes, of course he said that. It's here in scripture. And I said, I don't think he said, don't doubt. I think
Mm,
what he said was, don't doubt. There's no
mhm,
need to. I'm right here. Come,
mhm.
let's talk about it. Let's do life together. It's not what he said, but how he said it. It's the
Mm.
tone. And we assume because we've only got him saying, don't doubt, that it's this
Right.
voice of authority and condemnation. But what if it's a voice of love and grace and invitation that's saying,
Mm.
have faith, I'm right here.
And what if it's also his way of stating what actually is? When he says to his disciples, don't doubt, or when he says to Peter, you of little faith, it's not a condemnation. It's a statement of what is actually true. And then he invites them deeper into the boat where they can then have conversation that unlocks some of these things that are keeping him distant.
That's so
Yeah.
true. Because I am a person of little faith,
Yeah. Me
you know.
too. Yeah.
Mm.
Well, let's jump into Peter because his story is one of the ones I really wanted to spend time talking about because it sounds like both you and I can relate to Peter. I had asked you before our conversation, what's one of your go-to grace stories? You mentioned Peter, he's always one of mine. But you talk about the lie that we have to either believe or doubt that we can exist with both. But Peter's story teaches us something different. Take us into his story and what would it look like for us to be able to live in that space where we carry both doubt
Mm.
and faith?
Yeah, I just love Peter. He's so
Mm.
impulsive and rash and full on,
Yes.
whether he's doubting and questioning or jumping out of the
Hmm.
boat. And what I love is the story that's told in Matthew 14 and Mark 6, where the disciples are out in the boat and they see a figure that they're terrified is a ghost. And then Jesus calls to Peter and he
Mm.
says, "Come to me." And Peter's all in. So he jumps the boat,
Love that.
realizes that he is walking on water. He doesn't sink and he's got
Mm.
his eyes on Jesus. And then in an instant, he's struggling and Jesus holds out his hand. The bit that's so grace filled for me, Jennifer, is when they're back in the boat. All the disciples are there, worshipping and giving Jesus all the glory for who he is and what he's done. And it must have been amazing. And I imagine Peter sitting there, sopping wet, with
Mhm.
his wet tunic being a constant reminder how he doubted Jesus.
Mm.
And all the others are sitting there praising him. But we have to remember who Peter went on to be, how much Jesus loves him, and how he
Mm.
calls him the rock on which
Yeah.
he built the church that nothing can stand against. And this, to me, is such a story of grace in the moment and grace in the future and grace eternal. I just love Peter and have felt that feeling that I've let God down. I've felt the questioning, but I thought you said, "Come to me," and I did, and now I'm sinking. And so to me, this is such a great story about having faith and doubt all at the same time,
Mhm.
about not having to have it all figured out, but just keeping on coming back to Jesus.
It's back to what you said a little bit ago that God isn't surprised by the questions that we carry. He's not put off by our doubt or
No.
confused by it because he can see Peter's future just like he sees yours and
Mm.
mine and works with the reality of our limitations while we're in them. And I love that you brought out the grace forward movement of God at work in Peter, who becomes the rock on which the church is built. We
Yeah.
are living in the reality of this
Mm.
man who both doubted and believed at the same time. And that was enough for God.
Exactly.
Oh, I
And
love
for
that.
Peter, one of the things I say often is, what if our questions and our doubts aren't our faith's biggest
Mm.
weakness, but its biggest strength? What if they are our faith's superpower, not its kryptonite? And I think in this story, that's what we see.
Mm.
That these questions Peter asked of himself actually went on to be the fuel that grew
Yeah.
his faith
Hmm.
and that were his superpower because he knew he could relate to everyone. He knew that Jesus was unrelenting in his love for him.
So, say a little bit more then about the connection between doubt and grace, because I'm hearing there's a pretty important partnership here that we don't
Mm.
typically expect. I don't put the words doubt and grace in the same sentence typically, and yet that's what I'm hearing you say.
Grace covers everything.
Hmm.
It's the idea that, and I'm sure you've talked about this, the difference between mercy and
Hmm.
grace.
Yes.
Mercy is not getting what we do deserve, grace is getting what we don't deserve.
Mm.
And that idea of grace entering into our forgiveness and belonging and our sin and our brokenness and our healing and our
Mm.
transformation and our salvation. So, why exclude doubt? I can see
Yeah.
grace all the way through, it's God saying, I love you anyway. I know
Yeah.
you're doubting.
Yeah.
I know you will continue to doubt and question me and question my people and question my ways and question my providence and question my provision and my mercy, and you'll question it all.
Mm.
But you don't have to get it for me to love you. I love you not because I'm loving. I
Yeah.
love you because I am love itself. I
Hmm.
can't help but love you. And when we get that, we go, oh, so you mean I can ask anything? And he says,
Mm.
yep. And it doesn't mean we'll get the answers, but we
That's
can
true.
ask anything.
Hmm. Niki, tell us what's at stake when we silence our doubts, when we don't risk exploring them with God.
There's a lot at stake. And
Yeah.
it's not until we get to the point where we can see what we're about to lose that we're often inspired, motivated, whatever you want to call it, to start chatting with God
Mm.
about all these questions and disappointments that we have. But what's at stake is our relationship with God. Because if
Yeah.
you're anything like me, when you feel like God is silent, when you feel like he's not answering your questions, when you feel like he is not being the good and merciful God that you assumed that he is, you start saying, if you're not going to help me, I'm going to turn
Mm.
away. If you're not talking to
Mhm.
me, I'm not talking to you. And we do though one of those three things that we talked about before, which was we either fake it, force it, or fade away. Many of us are tempted to fade
Mm.
away because it's just easier. It's
Yeah.
easier to just say, I believe I just don't go to church anymore. I don't read my Bible
Mm.
anymore. I don't pray anymore. I always come back to this. I'm not going to stop praying because I lose my
Mm.
faith. I'm going to lose my faith because I stop praying. I'm going to lose my faith because I stop chatting with God. And so
Yeah.
that relationship with God that is so precious to many of us, even though it's changing, that's what's at stake. And I'm not going to say your salvation's at stake, but really it's intimacy, it's belonging, it's
Mm.
connection, it's all those things that we're really after.
So beautifully said. And it's God's grace that makes any of that all happen. Niki, this has been, I hope for many, I know for me, a very eye opening conversation that invites us, welcomes our questions and our doubts as we receive God's invitation to intimacy and expressing them. So, where can people find you? Where can they find your book? I know you have a beautiful resource available for people as well. So, tell us all things Niki Hardy and how can people find you?
Well, they can find me on my website, nikihardy.com. But everything God Can We Chat is handy dandily on godcanwechat.com. So on there, you can
Nice.
download the first three chapters if you want to taste and see before you buy it. There are also lots of resources in the book that you can download. There's a Hearing God's Voice guide, there is a group discussion guide, the chat conversation guides if you want to use those, all sorts of resources. Yes, in terms of buying the book, you can get it anywhere books are sold. I'm also on Substack and I publish under my name, but the publication is widely known.
Okay. I will make sure that all that information is in the show notes so that people can be in touch with you directly. Thank you, Niki, for gracing us here at Living the Grace Life.
You're welcome. It's been wonderful to chat.
Have you ever heard the phrase doubt walk before today's conversation with Niki? I hadn't before reading about it in her book. But I'm discovering it's exactly the kind of invitation to intimacy that I so often need when I'm turning in question after question and things that I simply don't understand. But in order to engage this doubt, you and I have to risk asking the hard questions. We have to be honest about where we actually are. The way Peter was with Jesus and the way Jesus was with Peter. Because at the end of the day, even though Peter started to sink, it was the Lord's hand that drew him up out of the water and equipped him to be the rock of the church that we are literally experiencing today, thousands of years later. Thanks for joining our conversation today. If today's episode encouraged you to hold on or helped you in your own grace walk, then would you share this with a friend? And if you haven't already done so, I'd appreciate your rating and review so it helps more listeners come alongside as we together live the grace life. As always, you can find me at jennifersakata.com, on Instagram at jennifersakata, or on Facebook at jennifersakata.author. Until next time, remember to live the grace life generously, friend. Grace for you, grace for them.